Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Who Knew Grannie, a dub opera by ahdri, zhina, mandiela. So Mandiela is a Toronto-based artist who she's from Jamaica originally, and she not only works on in the theater, but in performance, poetry, the performing arts, etc., etc. And you can see those influences here in this play. So basically, the storyline of Who Knew Grannie is fairly straightforward. You have the character Grannie who has died, and the four grandchildren are sort of called back for her funeral, and this aligns with a sort of existential calling back, or sort of coming to fruition of the cousins' different challenges that they're facing. So one of the things provided at the beginning of at least this published version is we get a lot of information about the characters. So we have Grannie, we have Chris, we have Licklebit, we have Tai, and we have Vilma. In addition to descriptions of the characters themselves, we have this section called What Do They Want or Need? And that's really significant because much of this play is about the challenges of, again, this is sort of existential fulfillment. The challenges of reconciling your desires or reconciling your sense of self with the world around you. So I'm going to read you out this section. Again, this is prior to the actual beginning of the play. This is the section, What Do They Want/Need? Grannie. Laying down for her final rest, she needs to know the cousins are ably and respectfully managing their lives and the world. Chris wants the world at his feet with full respect and acceptance. Licklebit needs to always recall and rediscover and hold on to Grannie, as this is what has kept her sane and in touch with herself and the world ever since. So, Licklebit. So I'll tell you a little bit about the characters. Chris is an entrepreneurial celebrity chef who's lived in the U.S. since running away in his early teens. He's gay, and that's been a big issue with his family back in Jamaica. We see these same kinds of concerns in something like Dorothea Smart's collection, Reader, I Married Him. The LGBT issues involved in many West Indian countries. So that's an element for Chris. Licklebit, she's 29. She has been living away from Grannie for a few years, staying with distant relatives in Canada where she receives eye therapy. She studies, teaches, and longs to go back home. She lost her eyesight from a degenerative eye disease, but has always seen and dreamed. So that's a big concern for Licklebit, is this sort of enforced migration to Canada in order to try and resolve her vision issues. Tai wants to change the world, but embraces mostly idealist ways and solutions. Needs the space and patience of the world while he creatively generates working solutions for all that ails. So Tai, who's 37, he is a musician and producer who's currently in prison in the UK for a smuggling conviction, which seems to be related to marijuana possession more than anything else. Vilma wants to lay down this burden of always being and expected to be in charge, but she really needs to accept that she has become one of the strong women she admires, like Grannie and her aunties. Vilma is the oldest, she's 39. She is a politician, and she's the only one still in Jamaica. And she's sort of the leader of this group of cousins, and she actually organizes getting everyone back to Jamaica for Granny's funeral. But each of the cousins has a sort of existential need, something that they require for personal fulfillment. And Granny's need, of course, is to see that they are fulfilled. But this is a really interesting element of the play, this idea that each character is driven by a particular goal, and that goal takes them away from home. Because one big sort of element of post-colonial studies, or post-colonial theory, is questions about diaspora, or diasporic dispersal of the people of a particular culture. So the African diaspora, for instance, which shapes much of Caribbean history. I mean, Africans were brought over to work largely as slaves on sugar plantations and things like that. The African American experience is a diasporic experience. People, again, brought out of Africa into slavery. We have the Irish diaspora, the Jewish diaspora, etc., etc. So the Indian diaspora. So we have all of these diasporic experiences from home nations or home regions, in the case of something like West Africa or South Asia. But in this case, and actually we see this also in a lot of other West Indian poetry, Caribbean poetry, from people like Grace Nichols, Dorothea Smart, Shara McCallum. There's a sort of secondary diaspora, a kind of Caribbean diaspora, in which people from Caribbean islands like Jamaica, like Barbados in the case of Dorothea Smart, Guyana in the case of Grace Nichols, leave to go elsewhere, whether that's to London, to the United States, to Canada. And so that becomes a sort of central thematic concern for the characters in this play, especially Licklebyt, but also Tai and Chris, all of whom have left home. And that's connected in the play to this sort of feeling of missing something, of some sort of missing piece. And as Granny's spirit interacts with the cousins throughout the play. She's in this sort of liminal space where she's died, but she hasn't yet sort of gone over to the other side. She's in this spirit space where she can engage with them and help them sort of on their quests. And so as Granny brings everyone back home, they increasingly begin to feel completed. And actually, so I mean, this is sort of directly explained in the stage directions a number of times. So at the end of the overture section, the stage directions say, "Granny is dead. The cousins need to be home for her passing ceremonies. But their lives are not all right. It's Granny's task to bring them back in tune with themselves." And that in tune metaphor is really significant, and I'll talk about music in just a second. She invokes Sankofa to get their attention, bring them together, rope them in. Sound of wings flapping, steady heartbeat returns and breathing, all slowly, then quickening. And by the end of the play, as all of the characters have come back together and come back for Granny's funeral, and sort of worked through their issues with the spirit of Granny helping them out, we get this section, and this is in the 14th movement, second to last section of the play. The stage directions say, "The cousins each slowly approach Granny laid out. Tai says, 'Here I am, emancipation in my hand. Vilma says, "Here I am, a woman, a feet on the ground politician." Chris, "Here I am, a man." Cousin's, "Full-fledged, understand?" Licklebit says, "Here I am, grown up like my gran." Cousins say, "Here we are, Granny." And then the stage directions, they see Granny now laid out in her rest. So, again, we've got this thematic interest in diaspora and the spreading out of people from the Caribbean, which is, of course, something that Mandiela would be centrally concerned with, being herself an immigrant from Jamaica to Canada. So this experience very much would resonate with her. And again, a lot of the other Caribbean poets that I've mentioned, Nichols, McCallum, Smart, have similar experiences of leaving their home countries to go elsewhere. So that experience of being an immigrant and of the challenges of navigating not being in your own cultural space or your birth cultural space, as it were, are things that we see consistently. This is the idea of diaspora and the concern with diaspora is something that the play actually, I think, really invites us to think about, because at one point we get this story of this guy named Kunu, who was brought over in the triangle trade from Africa as a slave, but he thought of it as a game. He didn't think of it as being enslaved. He thought of it as something enjoyable, a sort of pretend, a game. There's not really a better way of putting it. And it's interesting because the story comes up in the context of a sort of nursery rhyme in which people make fun of Kunu for being a fool, and Granny being a fool for not sort of realizing the seriousness of his situation. And Granny says, "Oh, but he wasn't a fool. Actually, he was cleverer than everyone else, and he realized what they didn't realize," which is, in a way, that not that slavery was not bad, because clearly it was, and I mean it's sort of shaped Jamaican experience, U.S. experience, etc., etc. But that there was a sort of way of resisting that, and this is in a way a post-colonial sort of insight, this idea of passive resistance, that Kunu doesn't overtly refuse to be a slave or anything like this. He doesn't sort of take up arms to fight his enslavers. He simply refuses to be mentally enslaved. So we've got that element, and that again encourages, I think, a diasporic reading, a diasporic focus here, because it is tied to slavery, but it's also tied to the other big thing that's going on in this play, which is music. Because Kunu wanted to use the drums that other slaves had constructed in secret. He wanted to use them to send a message back home, to let people know that he was all right, and to ask them how they were doing, etc., etc. But the other slaves refused to let him use them. But it says, we get this story here. "So when everybody gather that Christmas, when everybody," and this is Granny speaking, by the way, "when everybody dress up to mask and parade, when everybody line up to follow the Jing-Ping band, Kunu stayed behind, hidden with the drums. Yes, while all the masqueraders and marauders paraded in finery, stately chipping past Bakra big house and stables, Jing-Ping music permeating their hearts and toes and tingling their spines, As the folk celebrated with flair and elan and haughty flag-waving and elegant skirt-shaking and grandiose foot-stepping, Kunu set his little hands to the biggest drum he could find. And because Kunu was teeming with such melancholy, yes, because Kunu was in such a funky funk, his hands couldn't play, couldn't stay with the gentle tone of the mosquito beat he loved so much. As Kunu drummed up mosquito 1, mosquito 2, mosquito, 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 the cousins say, "Set it down now, Granny." Granny says, the music began to run away from him, and no matter how Kunu tried to catch and control it, the rhythm just ran wild. The quiver and the quake from Kunu's drum ran so hard it catch up with the jing-ping tune from the parading bands, and the two music held sway and began to circumnavigate one another, and soon they had tangled together and began gyrating and grinding and generating a whole new body revolution. And not a soul could stop it, no one could ignore it. A narrow body could just stand by and watch it. Everybody dancing and jumping and gyrating and chipping and cutting figure. So we've got this story of the music that blends, the music that becomes hybrid. And this is, again, the sort of cultural story of the Caribbean, the cultural story of Jamaica, and as well as other Caribbean islands. That Caribbean culture becomes a sort of fusion of these different elements, which is in this case represented by the music, by Kunu's mosquito beat and the Jing-Ping band, that these two types of music fuse together and become one that creates something new and unique. And of course, this is, again, in the Caribbean, you have histories of Spanish colonization, you have French colonization, Dutch colonization, British colonization, you have Africans brought over, you have people, I think, more recently, you have East Indians, people from India, Pakistan, Southeast Asia, and then you have the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, and all of these cultures sort of blend together in unique ways on the different islands to form these hybrid cultures. But we also don't want to ignore the fact that this is music. This is about music, this story, because this is, I mean, the subtitle here is a dub aria. Sorry. And so I don't know that much about dub. I'm not particularly familiar with this genre. I do know that it is a West Indian genre that was developed as a form of sort of cultural resistance, maybe, as a form of sort of resisting the hegemony of British culture in London. So it and elsewhere that Jamaican immigrants went. But it's musical. It's a form basically, dub poetry is a form of basically of sort of musical poetry, or poetry set to, I think, particularly reggae music. And that's what a lot of this play is. It reads to me as a play that's almost an opera, that's meant to be sung much more than it is to be read, or much more than it is to be spoken. So we've got that element. And it's not just here. This theme of music, the theme of music comes up repeatedly. Tai, like we saw that earlier reference to Granny needs to get them back in tune, the cousins back in tune. We also have this section where Tai from prison is sort of sending up this prayer. He says, "Help me slay the demon this time. Just sling one of my crisp rhythms into a special request and spin a new tune. Play it again, string it on cue, strum a little feel-good, swing low blues." And then Granny, the spirit of Granny, gives us a sort of a brief rendition of Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. So again, we've got all of these sort of musical elements that pervade the play, and the play itself, the style of the play, is so much shaped by music. That again, it feel, and I haven't seen it performed, so I don't know how it's been done. There are sections that are explicitly where the stage direction tells explicitly that this is sung, but almost the whole play to me feels like it could be sung. There are only a very, very small number of sections where it doesn't feel like you could accurately sing this.